All right. And another very interesting example in nature that we find today is these two fish that you see here are actually the same fish, that was a bad one, the same species, and they are called Mexican tetras. The difference is that the one on top lives in the open, in freshwater streams and so on, outside of caves, and the lower one is found inside of caves. And as you know, in caves, deep underwater in the caves, there's no light. So these fish, and this is found in many different caves, not just, well, there's not just like one big cave somewhere in Mexico where these are found, but in different parts of Mexico independently. The fish that found themselves somehow trapped inside of the caves evolved this same sort of characteristic where they have no eyes. So where the eyes should be, there's just like a spot there. And they develop this sort of translucent skin, so they lose the whatever pigmentation you have here that seems to have gotten lost in the cavefish. And again, this is found in multiple different streams around around Mexico, inside of caves and outside of caves, and you see the same pattern. The question is, what's going on, and why are these fish the same species? Why are some of them blind, some of them have sight, and so on? And we'll talk about some hypotheses to explain that during class. All right, one of the most famous examples of this situation is the Galapagos finches. And here we see a diagram of about 14 different species of Galapagos finches. And what's interesting about this is that when Charles Darwin, for example, traveled to the Galapagos and he brought back samples of these, he had no idea that they were all finches. They're so different from each other that Darwin thought that they were wrens and warblers and sparrows, for all I know. But what I found when he got back was that when an expert in birds, an ornithologist, took a look at the samples that he had brought back, he was informed that these were in fact all different varieties of finches. And you might say, well, so what? So there's a whole bunch of different finches that live on the Galapagos. Yes, as I was saying, so the interesting part is that these different types of finches are not found anywhere else on Earth except on the Galapagos. And you might again say, so what? Big deal. Well, it's because the Galapagos Islands, if you take a look at this map, are found off the coast on the equator around Ecuador, about 500 miles, 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador. And these are volcanic islands. That means that they rose up out of the oceans. They were not always here. And so you really kind of have a problem that you have to explain if you're going to say, well, first there were no islands, and then there were islands, and then all of a sudden there are birds on this island that don't exist anywhere else in the world. But over here in Ecuador, there are, on the coast of South America, there is a single species of finches that lives along here. And these finches over here, looking at DNA evidence and other pieces of connections or evidence that connect them, these finches are actually related to this fish. These finches are actually related to this finch that lives on the coast of South America. And so the obvious explanation is that the species of finch that lived here at some point in history when these islands developed blew over, flew over, perhaps in a storm that was able to carry them a vast distance in a relatively short amount of time. And the initial population of finches that lived here adapted to the different types of foods that were available on these islands. And so you had a proliferation or a spreading of different types of finches over many, many, many hundreds, if not thousands of years, as the finches populated these islands. And remember, these are volcanic islands, so they didn't have a lot of competition. So they got here, they were the first ones, perhaps the first birds on the islands, and so they were able to take advantage of all the food sources that in Ecuador, back over here on the mainland, those different types of food sources would already have been monopolized by some other species of birds. So there's not much room for the Galapagos, for the finches that live in the mainland, not much room for them to sort of spread out and grow and develop into different types of different features and so on. All right, so that's the Galapagos Islands, and just a quick view of how volcanic islands form deep in the ocean. There are deep in the mantle and of the Earth's structure. There are certain hot spots, and in these hot spots, occasionally you have this welling up of magma that eventually reaches the surface and forms a volcano. The volcano is underwater, but as the volcano erupts and spills out the lava, it builds up and builds up and builds up until it breaks through the surface of the ocean, and you have an island in the middle of the ocean. The thing is, because you may have learned in earth science about plate tectonics, this plate, especially out here in the Pacific, this plate is moving. It's moving in the direction of the arrow. And it's moving very slowly, so there's plenty of time for a volcano to form. And then at some point, the crust moves, and so the hot spot stays in one place, the crust moves over, and so you get a new island forming at a certain point. And remember, the time between these volcanic eruptions, they don't erupt like every other day, so there's a period of time while the pressure builds up. And during that time, as the crust moves, eventually there's so much movement that the tips of the islands are not able to break through the surface. Okay? This is just another satellite picture of the islands that make up the Galapagos. Again, you can see here that they are about 800, 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador. All right. Lastly, if we take a look at some of the, well, not lastly, but here's another example of an interesting phenomenon that we observe in nature, that the arm bones, the upper arm bone, the humerus, and the lower arm bones, the radius and the ulna, then you have your wrist bones, the carpals and the metacarpals. These are found, these same structures are found in just about all four-legged creatures, especially mammals. And you can see that in humans, cats, whales have similar bones. Now they may have lost a few bones over here over time, but the same structure. This represents the humerus, the radius and the ulna, metacarpals and carpals. Same thing in a bat. The wings of a bat are actually the arms and the fingers and the hands of the same bone structures that we have in our hands, just organized a little bit differently. Okay. And lastly, this is one of the most puzzling things that I think you'll find very fascinating. This animal is called a platypus. Some of you read about it before. It used to be called the duck-billed platypus, but they've changed that name to just platypus for the most part, or officially it's just called platypus. What's extremely interesting about this animal is that it's considered a mammal. It has fur, as you can see in this picture. It has a weird-looking bill that resembles a duck in some ways, which is where it got its original name from. It has webbed feet. It's highly aquatic. But you'll notice that it's standing here next to a nest of eggs. That's because this mammal lays eggs. And we usually think of laying eggs in association with things like reptiles and well, not amphibians don't have a hard shell on the outside, but chickens and birds and reptiles lay this type of egg. But this is a mammal that lays eggs. We also think of mammals as producing milk, and we usually, when we think of milk, we think of the nipple, what's technically called the teat of the animal. The platypus doesn't have that. It has mammary glands, just like humans and other mammals, but it does not have teats, as they're called, and instead it has these grooves in its skin, in its belly, and the milk just sort of oozes out of these pores and into the grooves, and the babies, once they've hatched from the eggs, they just lick the milk from the mother's belly. So they're very strange creatures, and we will talk a little bit more about those as the time comes up when we talk about mammals and how they've developed over time. Okay, so I know this went on a little bit longer than I expected, but it's really not a whole lot of content. It's a lot of questions and things for you to think about. I hope you'll jot down some questions and bring them to class so that we can start discussing them later in the week. Thank you very much.